Thank you, Dave, and Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Happy Hanukkah. Great to be with you. You know, as Dave mentioned, the only time Hanukkah is mentioned in the entire Bible is this one passage in our Besorah from Yochanan chapter 10. And I would like to discuss that passage with you. And the basic theme here is increasing light. Increasing light. But first, let's talk a little bit about Hanukkah. You see, we sometimes have idealized and somewhat unrealistic understandings of things that happened in the past. We know that Hanukkah occurred about a century and a half, 160 years or so before the birth of Yeshua, and it was a very difficult time in Israel, but for two reasons, not just one. One, of course, is that the Seleucid king, the Syrian king, Antiochus IV, had invaded, and he was demanding that Jewish life really be stamped out in Israel. But there was another complication, and that is you had a radical divide within Israel among Jews in terms of their attitude toward Antiochus and the things he was trying to push, a very Greek-oriented culture, etc., etc. So some Jews might have said something like this: we like the gymnasium in Jerusalem. There was a big gymnasium in Jerusalem. We like the gymnasium in Jerusalem. So what if the guys compete with no clothes on? They have a terrific sports program for the kids. All right? Yeah. And then you had other Jews who said the Greeks want to destroy Jewish life. No Torah, no Brit Milah. They have to go. And of course, the second group, and we're quite glad, of course, won the day, and the temple was cleansed and rededicated. And so here we are. Now, I'm reading a terrific book. I want to talk about this division thing. I'm reading a terrific book, which I want to recommend to you. It's simply called Grant. And it is the biography, it's about this thick, of General Ulysses S. Grant, and it was written by Ron Chernow, who's the fellow who did Hamilton, the very famous Broadway play, which everyone is just so crazy about. I haven't seen it. But what he points out in the book is that Grant was a great, great hero. He was a truly fine human being and sought to increase the light, if you will, of Abraham Lincoln after his death to make sure that the black community in America was treated properly in light of the 13th and 14th Amendments, and wanted to have a very compassionate kind of transition through Reconstruction. But it was a very tough moment, and we just are so crazy about Grant. He made one mistake with respect to the Jewish people. Don't have to get into it. He banished some people, and he apologized for it, and even on his deathbed expressed remorse. But what was so interesting when we think about Hanukkah and the division between the Jewish people is that it was that way during the Civil War as well. Let me quote, this is Rabbi Bertram Korn, who writes on what it was like to be a Jewish person living in the South during that period. And he says, for Southern Jews, loyalty to the Confederacy was often a matter of intense personal gratitude. Nowhere else in America had they, that is the Jewish people, experienced such fullness of opportunity and achieved comparable political and social acceptance. And you go, wow, that's amazing. Jews at the time were treated badly in the North, a lot of prejudice, a lot of anti-Semitism. Relatively speaking, in the South, there was much, much less. One of those paradoxical moments. In fact, Judah Benjamin serves as the Attorney General, the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of State of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And it kind of is difficult to get a handle on that. But as in the time of the Hasmoneans, that is in the time of Judah Maccabee and Antiochus, there was a real division among people. And of course, we see this here too. Okay, back to the text. And so Yeshua was in the temple. He was in the temple courts, walking in Solomon's colonnade. That is a bunch of columns with a covering at the eastern edge of the Temple Mount. And the Jewish leadership who were there gathered around him, saying, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you're truly the Messiah, tell us plainly." Yeshua answered, "I did tell you, but you did not believe. The works I do in my Father's name testify about me, but if you do not believe, you do not believe because you are not of my sheep. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me." I believe that in the context of Hanukkah, Yeshua is using the image of the Good Shepherd because, in a sense, the Maccabees were shepherds of Israel. Now, there's no strong textual evidence that they were called shepherds in Israel, but just generally speaking, they did shepherd Israel through this period of darkness and into light. And so I think that Yeshua is emphasizing his being the Good Shepherd is reflective of his comparison with the Maccabees and other leaders, where he says, there was light there, but I bring increasing light. I'm the Good Shepherd. I am the Good Shepherd. Now, keep in mind also that by the time of Yeshua, which was, like I say, we're talking almost 200 years now after the Maccabees, the people who took over from the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty, the high priests, weren't all good guys. As a matter of fact, in the popular view of many Jews in Yeshua's time, the Hasmoneans were not good shepherds at all. As a matter of fact, they were in cahoots with the Romans and sold and bought the high priesthood, and it wasn't all that good. But again, by comparison with all this, Yeshua says, I'm the good shepherd, and my sheep know my voice. He goes on to say, I'm in verse 28 of chapter 10, I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one can snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one. Wow. What a statement that is. I and the Father are one. Now, it was an audacious statement, but did he only mean that he was one in purpose with the Father? That his will aligned with the Father? Was that it? Well, no. He meant something far more dramatic than that, and this is clear from how his hearers heard him. Verse 31, again, his Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him, and Yeshua said to them, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? Works of healing and blessing and people with demonic issues healed and stories of him quelling storms just like that and all these other attestations of who he was, which was increasingly becoming known among the people. There was no way to deny it. We are not stoning you for any good work, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. What's the problem here? What is the basic problem? Well, I want to suggest the problem is that his antagonists had a worldview which just couldn't encompass him as the promised one of Israel. In other words, we know that Jews in the first century had no real problem with God showing up on the earth. You have that in the case of Abraham, who appears. God appears to Abraham in the book of Bereshit, in Genesis. Theoretically, it wasn't a huge problem, but it was one thing to agree to the abstract idea that, yes, God can show up in this world. That was, again, commonly understood. It's another thing to look at this actual guy from the Galil who claims to be the fulfillment of that very reality. And so we can understand that. We don't justify it, but we understand about it. So we really have this divide. Again, you had a divide in the time of the Maccabees. You had a divide in the time of the Civil War. And now moving back to the time of Yeshua, we have him as a source of divide among our people. You see, again, in Yeshua's day, he seeks to bypass. He tries to get around the confirmation bias and the groupthink of Jerusalem-based religious orthodoxy by saying, Here's what he's saying to them. This is the argument of the chapter. Look deeply at the undeniably miraculous things that I do and consider the implications. But they weren't willing to do that. No dice, they said, and they just, of course, were not going to receive him. And so Yeshua then leaves Jerusalem, and it says, the chapter closes, then Yeshua went back across the Jordan to the place where Yochanan had been baptizing in the early days. And some of you, if you've been on tours with us or if you've been in Israel, you know roughly where that was in the Jordan as you are approaching the Dead Sea. And it was a very barren place and sparsely populated. So then he stayed, and many people came to him. And they said, though Yochanan never performed a sign, all that Yochanan said about this man is true. And in that place, many believed in Yeshua. And so we have kind of a biblical theme expressing itself. We have the theme of increasing light, which we'll talk about. But along the way, we have this very interesting dynamic. And that is that sometimes the average person, unhindered by powerful groupthink, can draw the right conclusions and can act more wisely than the insiders. These more rural people, they said, look, no one does the miracles that this guy did, and they were willing to put their faith in him, where again, others were blocked from seeing it. Now, I want to bring this all up to right now as we conclude. I believe the times we're living in now are unique. I remember the Viet Nam War era, and there was division in the country for sure, but I think what we're seeing is even more than that. I've never seen such division and such uncertainty in the United States because of all the stuff we know about. Now, the question for us today is, what is our reference point as we live during this time of uncertainty and confusion and people having radically different opinions about all kinds of different things? How do we set our feet? How do we set our feet so we can navigate these troubled waters? Now, the answer, I believe, comes from one verse in this chapter. And here it is. Here's the verse, and here's what I think God would have us know about the increasing light through Hanukkah and Yeshua, and how to apply that reality in the current moment. Here it is. Yeshua says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. That's it. He's the good shepherd. He's the fabulous shepherd. And how do we know it? Even more than the miracles that we read about, maybe historically attested, etc. The most important thing, the thing that allows us to plant our feet and find joy and blessing, even during this tumultuous moment, is knowing that he proved his goodness by laying down his life for his sheep. That is a fabulous, fabulous thought, and it's a true thought, because it bespeaks of a sacrificial love of God that's even more glorious than, if we can speak this way, of the fact that he created everything. I suppose you'd expect that. But the fact that he was willing to send the Mashiach, a piece of himself, to give himself for us, that is an expression of a kind of love that is so magnificent that if we get a hold of it, no matter what the twists and turns of history, the difficulties in understanding the moment we're living in, the perplexities, etc., is what we need to know. One who acted, to borrow the great phrase from the jazz saxophonist John Coltrane, a love supreme, one of his album names. This love supreme. He, by his Ruach, will guide us through. The light is shining and it is increasing because of this magnificent Yeshua we celebrate during this Hanukkah season and during this time of remembering his birth. Shabbat Shalom and happy Hanukkah to you all.